There is a heft that arrives without publicizing itself. Not sadness, not despondency, something slower. A gravity that pulls inward rather than down. You wake up with it already present, as if it never completely left while you slept. It does not feel dramatic enough to justify concern. That is part of the problem. You can still function, you still respond, you still show up, but everything requires a bit more effort than it should, like the world has subtly increased its resistance overnight. You notice it in small delays. The pause before replying, the extra moment it takes to start something simple, the way your body hesitates before movement. Not from exhaustion, but from calculation. Nothing feels urgent, and that absence of urgency is unsettling. People around you assume calm. They see composure, restraint, control. They mistake your stillness for stability. They do not see the internal narrowing that is happening slowly, steadily, without drama. You do not talk about it because you do not have language for it yet. You do not even know if it is something to talk about. It feels too vague, too diffused, like trying to describe fog from inside it. There is a particular sensation that comes with this state. A sense that your inner world has gone quiet in a way that is not peaceful. Thoughts still move, but cautiously. Feelings still exist, but they do not rush forward. It is as if something inside you learned to lower the volume long ago, and now it does not remember how to turn it back up. You do not feel broken. You feel muted. This muting does not happen all at once. It arrives through repetition, through moments where expression feels unnecessary, through situations where responding fully would require too much exposure for too little return. Over time, you begin to default to restraint. You hold things in not because you are afraid of expressing them, but because expressing them rarely changes anything. You have noticed that emotional honesty does not always lead to emotional safety. Sometimes it leads to unpredictability, misinterpretation, or increased pressure. So you learn to keep things manageable. Manageable becomes the goal. You start choosing internal order over external expression. You simplify responses. You streamline reactions. You remove excess emotion, not to suppress it, but to reduce variables. This reduction works. It keeps things stable. It also removes color. You do not realize what is missing at first. You only notice that joy feels distant, not absent, but harder to access. It arrives briefly, then recedes. It does not linger the way it seems to for others. You do not chase it. Chasing feels futile. You have always been good at reading rooms, sensing undercurrents, anticipating shifts before they happen. That skill has not disappeared. If anything, it has sharpened. You pick up on changes quickly. You adapt easily. But that adaptation has a cost. Each time you adjust, something in you steps back. Each time you accommodate, you retreat a little further inward. You do not resist this. It feels natural, logical, protective. Eventually, the inside becomes quieter than you remember it being. Not empty, just still. You may notice that you are no longer strongly drawn to things you once enjoyed. Not because they have lost value, but because engaging fully would require a level of openness you no longer offer by default. This is avoidance, but without fear. It is caution without panic. Your system has learned that staying partially disengaged preserves equilibrium. It keeps emotional volatility low. It reduces the risk of being overwhelmed by external input. The trade-off is subtle. You do not experience high highs. You also do not experience deep lows. Everything settles into a narrow band of experience, predictable control. From the outside, this looks like emotional maturity, like balance, like strength. People may even admire how composed you are under pressure. They do not see how much of that composure comes from limitation rather than expansion. You have limited how much you allow yourself to feel, not intentionally, but automatically. You notice how rarely you feel surprised by people now. Disappointed, yes, but surprise? No. You expect inconsistency. You plan for misalignment. You anticipate withdrawal. These expectations do not hurt. They stabilize. But stability achieved this way has a particular texture. It is flat, dependable, safe, and slowly, quietly, it begins to feel heavy. You may catch yourself staring into space more often, not lost in thought, just resting in stillness. There is a sense of waiting without knowing what you are waiting for. Energy feels conserved rather than expressed. You do not burn out. You dim. This dimming is not obvious. You still care. You still empathize. You still understand others deeply, perhaps more deeply than ever, but you are no longer moved by it in the same way. You observe rather than absorb. At first, this feels like growth, like refinement, like becoming less reactive and more measured. You tell yourself it is maturity, and in some ways, it is. But there is a contradiction you cannot ignore. The more controlled your inner world becomes, the less alive it feels. Not chaotic, not painful, just distant. You do not crave intensity. You crave something harder to define. Internal movement without alarm. Feeling without management. That longing stays quiet. It does not demand attention. It simply exists beneath the surface, unresolved. You may wonder whether this is just adulthood, whether everyone eventually feels this way, whether the heaviness is simply time accumulating. But when you watch others, you notice something different. They change. They rise and fall. They react strongly, recover, react again. You remain steady to steady. A part of you recognizes that this steadiness is a strategy, not a state. Something developed to keep emotions predictable. You do not yet question where that strategy came from. You only notice its effects. And the effect is this quiet weight that does not lift. Even when things are objectively fine, you do not feel unsafe. You feel internally withdrawn. That withdrawal is not sadness. It is something more structural, something that has not yet been named. The shift begins when you stop asking what is wrong with you and start noticing what your system has been protecting you from. The stillness you carry is not emptiness. It is restraint. Taken too far, what you once called emotional distance begins to look like contraction, not a lack of feeling, but feeling folded inward so tightly that it has nowhere to move. This is where clarity emerges, and it does not soften the experience. Highly empathic people who grow up in emotionally unsafe environments do not lose their sensitivity. They learn to limit its expression. They learn early that being fully open comes with unpredictable consequences. So openness becomes cautious. This adaptation does not occur in a single moment. It develops gradually, through repeated experiences where emotional expression leads to insecurity rather than connection. Over time, your system learns to prioritize stability over expression. That priority becomes automatic. In adulthood, this appears as emotional dampening. You still feel deeply, but you process inwardly rather than outwardly. You reduce friction. You minimize emotional exposure. You keep your inner world contained to maintain control. This strategy works until it doesn't. What makes this state so confusing is that it does not feel like pain. It feels like a lack of movement, like standing in a room where the air does not circulate. You are not unhappy enough to seek change. You are not content enough to feel alive. You live in between. This in-between state is often mislabeled as personality, introversion, calmness, maturity. Many people praise it without realizing what it is. A system designed to survive emotional unpredictability by limiting internal movement. Eventually, it becomes possible to name what has formed. Depression shaped by emotional constraint does not arrive as overt sadness. It arrives as sustained emotional narrowing and adaptation that once served a purpose and has now exceeded its usefulness. It is not the presence of pain. It is the absence of expansion. You did not become depressed because you were weak. You became depressed because your system learned that reducing emotional range was the safest way to remain functional. That reduction kept you functioning. It kept you perceptive. It kept you capable. It also slowly removed access to vitality. This form of depression is often misunderstood because it hides beneath competence, empathy, and apparent stability. You do not collapse. You do not fall apart. You continue, but with less internal movement than you were meant to have. This condition does not fluctuate easily. It is not a mood. It is not a response to current circumstances. It is the long-term result of adapting to environments where emotional expression was not consistently met with safety. Your system learned self-sufficiency early. That self-sufficiency became structural. As an adult, this structure resists change because it has been reinforced over time. Each moment of emotional restraint strengthens the pattern. Each instance of containment confirms its necessity. This does not mean you cannot feel joy or connection. It means those moments do not reach deeply enough to reorganize the system. They touch the surface. They do not reach the foundation. People assume depression always involves despair or visible suffering. Yours involves quiet endurance. You do not want to give up. You have simply adapted to living with lower intensity, lower expectation, lower emotional movement. This adaptation once kept you safe. Now, it keeps you distant from yourself. The unsettling truth is that the same adaptation that made you perceptive and compassionate also laid the groundwork for this internal narrowing. You survived by containing emotion rather than expressing it. That lesson did not fade with time. It became embedded. You did not develop this state because you failed to cope. You developed it because you coped too well for too long. Your system did exactly what it was designed to do. The cost of that design is a persistent emotional flatness that does not respond to stimulation, insight, or external improvement. It does not lift when life improves because it is not about circumstances, it is about configuration. This understanding does not bring relief. It brings recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, does not need to be shared. It needs to be lived with.